The ship's horn split the fog like a scream swallowed by cotton. Greta Hoffmann stood at the railing of the USS General Meigs, her knuckles white against the salt-corroded metal, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from the morning mist like a ghost materializing from memory. The copper giant held her torch aloft, and Greta thought absurdly of her mother's hand reaching for the light switch in their Dresden kitchen. The one she'd never see again, buried now under rubble and ash. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. "She's bigger than I imagined," whispered Ilse Kramer beside her, a woman who'd served as a radio operator in Bremen before the bombs came. Her voice carried that hollow quality they all shared now, like instruments whose strings had been cut but still remembered the shape of music. Behind them, 347 German women stood pressed together on the deck, their threadbare coats inadequate against the October wind of 1945. They were prisoners of war, though the term felt strange on Greta's tongue. She'd been a secretary at a Luftwaffe supply depot in Munich, typing manifests for boots and ration tins while the world burned. Now she was this. A woman in a borrowed coat, her country defeated, her future a question mark written in a foreign language. The harbor smelled of diesel and fish and something else. Something Greta would later identify as American prosperity. That particular scent of abundance that made her stomach clench with shame and hunger in equal measure. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and indifferent. A tugboat churned past, its wake rocking their vessel, and someone behind Greta began to cry softly, the sound barely audible over the water and wind and the thrum of the ship's engines winding down. "Do you think they'll hang us?" This from Margaret Schultz, a farmer's daughter from Bavaria who'd worked in a munitions factory. She was 19, with hands already weathered like old leather, and eyes that hadn't quite accepted what had happened to the world they'd known. "Don't be stupid," Ilse said, but without conviction. None of them knew what awaited them. The rumors aboard ship had multiplied like bacteria in standing water. They'd be put to work in American factories, locked in camps worse than the ones they'd heard whispered about in the final days of the war, sent back to a Germany that no longer existed, at least not in any form they could recognize. Greta had her own theory, formed from the fragments of English she'd picked up and the strange gentleness of some of their guards. American soldiers who offered cigarettes and spoke in tones that lacked the sharp edge of hatred she'd expected. She thought perhaps the Americans didn't quite know what to do with them either. They were an inconvenience, a footnote to a war that had already moved on to its aftermath. Women who'd been adjacent to atrocity without quite committing it themselves. The ship docked with a groan of metal and rope. The women were herded, though guided might have been more accurate, the American MPs more bureaucratic than brutal, down the gangplank and into a processing facility that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. Everything was written in English, and Greta found herself translating for the others, her 4 years of secondary school language study suddenly the most valuable currency she possessed. Name, date of birth, place of birth, occupation. The questions were repeated 347 times, each answer recorded by a bored corporal who chewed gum with the mechanical precision of a metronome. Greta wondered if he saw them as individuals or just a procession of defeated enemy faces, all blending together in the fluorescent light. They were loaded onto buses, actual buses with cushioned seats, not trucks with wooden benches, and driven through Brooklyn in the late afternoon. Greta pressed her face to the window like a child, watching the city unfold in layers of impossible plenty. Store windows displayed more food than she'd seen in 3 years. Pyramids of oranges, sides of beef hanging in butcher shops, bakeries with cakes frosted in colors that seemed to belong to some fever dream of abundance. Children played on sidewalks, their coats new, their faces round with health. Women pushed baby carriages and carried shopping bags stuffed with purchases, and not a single building bore the scars of bombing. "It's not real," Ilse murmured beside her. "It can't be real." But it was. The bus carried them past car dealerships with rows of shining vehicles, past movie theaters advertising films with names Greta couldn't pronounce, past restaurants where people sat at tables visible through plate glass windows, eating meals that probably contained more meat than a German family would see in a month. The contrast was so violent it felt like a physical blow. Berlin was rubble. Dresden was ash. Hamburg was a graveyard. And here was New York, untouched, thriving, abundant beyond anything Greta's recent memory could accommodate. The camp, they called it a camp, though it was actually a former military barracks in New Jersey, was surrounded by chain-link fence. But the gates stood open during the day. The barracks were heated. There were real beds with clean sheets, a cafeteria that served 3 meals daily, and showers with hot water that ran whenever they wanted it. That first night, Greta stood under the spray until her skin turned pink, watching years of fear and hunger and ash swirl down the drain, knowing it couldn't be so simple but unable to stop herself from hoping it might be. The rules were explained by Captain Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 30s with auburn hair pinned in victory rolls and a manner that fell somewhere between a schoolteacher and a sympathetic aunt. She spoke slowly, allowing for translation, and her eyes held something Greta couldn't quite identify. Not pity exactly, but perhaps a kind of complicated compassion. "You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention," Captain Morrison said, standing before them in the cafeteria that smelled of coffee and something that might have been meatloaf. "You will be treated with respect and dignity. You will work. We have arrangements with local factories and farms that need labor. You will be paid a small wage. And on Sundays, if you wish, you may have supervised visits to New York City." The silence that followed was profound. Greta looked at Ilsa, then at Margaret, then at the rows of women behind them, all wearing the same expression of stunned disbelief. Visit New York City? Really? The conqueror's capital, and they were being offered it like a gift? Why? The question came from somewhere in the back, spoken in German by a voice Greta didn't recognize. Captain Morrison seemed to understand without translation. "Because the war is over," she said simply. "And because treating you humanely is the right thing to do. Also, frankly, because keeping you locked up serves no purpose and costs resources better spent elsewhere." She paused, allowing that pragmatic truth to settle. "The buses leave at 9 a.m. Sunday morning. You'll return by 6 p.m. You'll be accompanied by guards. But they're there for your safety as much as supervision. New York can be overwhelming." That night, the barracks buzzed with whispered conversations that lasted until dawn. Some women refused to believe it, convinced it was a trap. They'd be taken to the city and shot, or put on display as monsters, or separated and interrogated about war crimes they hadn't committed. Others, like Margaret, saw it as a test of their humanity, a chance to prove they weren't the beasts Allied propaganda had painted them as. Greta lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where water stains formed continents she couldn't name, and tried to understand what she felt. Shame, certainly. The crushing weight of knowing that while New York gleamed with abundance, her people were starving in ruins of their own making. Fear, obviously. She was still a prisoner in a foreign land whose language she barely spoke. But underneath those familiar emotions, something else stirred. Curiosity, maybe, or the faint pulse of hope, so fragile she was afraid to acknowledge it, that perhaps the world wasn't entirely the hell she'd come to accept as permanent. The symbolic object came to her attention the next morning. While unpacking the meager belongings they'd been allowed to keep, Greta found it at the bottom of her satchel. A small brass compass her father had given her on her 16th birthday, before the war, when she talked about becoming a teacher and traveling to see the Mediterranean. "So you always know which way is home," he'd said, pressing it into her palm. Home was gone now. The apartment in Munich where she'd grown up had been bombed in a raid in early 1944. Her father had died at Stalingrad. Her mother and younger sister had fled east ahead of the Russian advance and vanished into the chaos of displaced millions. Home was an abstraction, a ghost, a concept that no longer corresponded to any physical place on Earth. Still, Greta kept the compass. She held it in her palm that Friday night, watching the needle swing and settle, pointing northeast toward. What? The barracks? The Atlantic? The ruins of Germany somewhere beyond the curve of the world? The needle didn't care about borders or defeat or the weight of history. It just pointed toward magnetic north, indifferent and absolute. "Are you going on Sunday?" Ilsa asked from the neighboring bunk. She was mending a torn stocking with thread she'd scrounged from somewhere, her needle moving with the economical precision of someone who'd learned to make everything last. "I don't know," Greta admitted. Are you? I think I have to, Ilse said slowly. Not because I want to. God knows I'm terrified. But because if I don't, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what I was too afraid to see. She knotted her thread and bit it clean. Besides, when will we ever have another chance? We're going home eventually, assuming there's still a home to go to. This might be the only time in our lives we stand in the middle of New York City. The logic was undeniable, though it did nothing to settle the anxiety churning in Greta's stomach. That night she dreamed of walking through Manhattan while the buildings leaned inward and whispered in her father's voice, asking why she'd survived when so many hadn't, why she deserved to see this gleaming, untouched city when her sister was probably dead in a ditch somewhere east of Berlin. Sunday morning arrived wrapped in crystalline autumn light. 183 women volunteered for the first trip, the others too scared or too proud or too broken to face the conqueror's paradise. They dressed in the best clothes they had, which meant mended dresses and coats with missing buttons, and tried to make themselves presentable with the few cosmetics they'd managed to keep. Greta braided her blonde hair and pinned it in a crown, the way her mother had taught her, and looked at herself in the spotted mirror above the sink. 27 years old and feeling ancient, her face thin, her eyes holding depths that hadn't been there before the war. The buses were waiting. The same American MPs from the processing center served as escorts, young men mostly, some barely older than Margaret. They didn't wear the harsh expressions Greta had expected. One of them, a freckled boy from somewhere called Iowa, helped an elderly woman, Frau Bergman, who'd been a postal clerk in Stuttgart, up the steps with genuine gentleness. "First time in New York?" he asked Greta in English as she boarded. "First time in America," she replied carefully, her accent thick but comprehensible. He grinned. "Well, you picked a hell of a city to start with. It's something else." The drive took 40 minutes through industrial stretches that gradually gave way to the dense miracle of Manhattan. The bus crossed a bridge. The guard said it was called the George Washington Bridge, and suddenly they were in the city proper, swallowed by canyons of steel and stone that climbed toward a sky impossibly blue and clear. Greta had been to Berlin before the war, had thought she understood what a city could be. But this was different. Berlin had been grand in that deliberate fascist way, all marble and monumental angles designed to make individuals feel small before the state. New York was grand by accident of its own explosive growth, a vertical forest of ambition and commerce and human energy compressed into an island of granite. It was beautiful and terrifying and utterly alien. They were let out at Times Square. The square itself was an assault of light and motion and advertisement, huge billboards hawking everything from Coca-Cola to Lucky Strike cigarettes, theaters announcing shows with marquees that blazed even in daylight, crowds of people moving in currents that had their own mysterious logic. "Stay together in groups of at least 3, Captain Morrison instructed through a translator. "You have until 5 p.m. The buses will be here waiting. If you get lost or need help, find a police officer, they've been briefed. And remember, you're representing your country, even in defeat. Conduct yourselves accordingly." Then, incredibly, they were simply released. No chains, no close guards breathing down their necks. Just small clusters of German women standing at the edge of Times Square, free to walk into the heart of American power, and nobody seemed to care. "Where do we go?" Margaret asked, her voice small and overwhelmed. "Everywhere," Ilse said, and took Greta's arm. They walked north first, joining the flow of pedestrians on Broadway. The shop windows were bottomless wells of plenty. Clothing stores with racks of dresses in every color, shoe stores with walls of leather goods, drugstores stocked with medicines and cosmetics and mysterious American products Greta couldn't identify. In one window, a jewelry store displayed diamond rings on velvet, their price tags showing numbers that would have fed a German family for a year. A woman emerged from the jewelry store carrying a small bag, her coat made of what looked like genuine fur, her shoes glossy with newness. She walked past the 3 Germans without a second glance, just another prosperous citizen in a prosperous city, unaware or uncaring that she'd just spent more money than Greta had seen in 4 years. "I hate her," Margaret whispered. "You don't," Greta said gently. "You hate what she represents. But she's just a woman who bought herself something nice. In another world, you might have been her." In another world, we wouldn't have started a war, Ilsa said flatly. They walked in silence after that, carrying the weight of that truth through streets that neither knew nor cared about their guilt. They passed a newsstand where the headlines shouted about the Nuremberg trials, photos of Göring and Hess and others in the dock, facing justice that came too late for millions. An old man buying a paper glanced at them, and Greta tensed, waiting for recognition, for accusation. But he just nodded politely and walked on. At Rockefeller Center, they stood at the edge of the plaza and looked up at the soaring Art Deco tower, its limestone facade catching the October sun. Below, in the sunken plaza, preparations were underway for what a helpful guide explained would be a skating rink come winter. The idea seemed fantastical. A city so secure, so wealthy, so untouched by war that it could freeze water for recreation in the middle of Manhattan. My brother would have loved this, Margaret said suddenly. Franz. He died at Kursk. He loved ice skating. She said it matter-of-factly, but her eyes were wet. They bought lunch from a street vendor, hot dogs, which they'd heard about but never tasted, swimming in mustard and relish. The vendor, a middle-aged man with a Greek accent, charged them the regular price and wished them a nice day, either unaware of their origin or simply indifferent to it. The hot dog was the most delicious thing Greta had eaten in years, and that fact made her want to weep. In Central Park, they sat on a bench and watched children play. American children, healthy and loud and abundant. Their parents relaxed in a way German parents hadn't been for a decade. A little girl in a red coat chased pigeons, her laughter carrying across the grass like bells. Her mother sat nearby, reading a magazine, not watching the sky for bombers, not calculating rations, not teaching her daughter how to recognize the sound of incoming artillery. Do you think we'll ever have that? Margaret asked. That lightness. I don't know, Greta admitted, but someone will, someday. Even in Germany, children will play without fear again. She wasn't sure she believed it, but she needed to say it aloud, to put the hope into words and see if they could bear the weight. As the afternoon wore on, they wandered through the Museum of Natural History. Free admission, another incomprehensible gift, and stood beneath the skeleton of a blue whale, trying to comprehend something so vast and peaceful in a world that had recently been consumed by violence. They walked past Carnegie Hall and heard music floating from an open door, something classical that Greta recognized but couldn't name, and felt the old civilized world they'd known assert itself briefly against the ruins. At a coffee shop on 7th Avenue, Ilsa counted out the few American coins they'd been given as a small allowance and ordered 3 cups of coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute they'd been choking down for years. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, brought the cups and lingered. You girls okay? She asked, her accent pure New York. You look a little lost. We're fine, thank you, Greta said carefully. The waitress studied them more closely, and Greta saw the moment recognition dawned. Not of them specifically, but of what they were. The accents, the worn clothes, the way they held themselves, still too careful, too watchful, like animals expecting a blow. You're those German girls, the waitress said. It wasn't quite a question. The 3 of them froze. This was the moment they'd been dreading, when someone would see them for what they were and the hatred would come pouring out. Greta prepared herself for it, already forming apologies in her careful English. But the waitress just sighed and refilled their cups without asking. War's a bitch, isn't it? She said. My nephew died at Anzio. My son came back from France with half his face missing. I got no love for Hitler, but I guess you girls probably didn't have much choice in the matter. She paused, seemed to consider something, then added, The pie's good here, lemon meringue. On the house if you want it. Greta felt tears prick her eyes and didn't know why. This small, unexpected kindness from a woman who had every reason to hate them felt more overwhelming than all the city's splendor. Thank you, she managed. Yeah, well, the waitress shrugged. Somebody's got to start forgiving somebody, or this whole thing never ends. She walked away before Greta could respond. The lemon meringue pie was good. They ate it slowly, savoring every bite, and didn't talk about what had just happened, because to discuss it would be to risk shattering the fragile moment of grace they'd been granted. Greta's days in the camp settled into a rhythm that felt simultaneously strange and desperately needed. Structure, it turned out, was a kind of mercy after the chaos of war's end. She woke at 6:30 each morning to the sound of reveille played over scratchy speakers, dressed in the work clothes provided by the Americans, sturdy dungarees and cotton shirts that still smelled faintly of factory chemicals, and joined the line for breakfast in the cafeteria. The food remained a source of constant astonishment. Oatmeal with brown sugar, eggs, actual eggs, not powdered substitutes, toast with butter and jam, coffee that was rich and dark, the way coffee was supposed to taste. Greta tried not to think about her mother and sister, wherever they were, or about the reports filtering back from Germany of people eating grass and tree bark to survive. The guilt sat in her stomach alongside the abundance, curdling every meal. Her work assignment was at a textile mill 15 minutes away by truck. The mill produced sheets and towels, mundane peacetime goods that felt like luxuries after years of everything being converted to the war effort. Greta worked a large loom, her hands learning the rhythm of thread and shuttle, her mind free to wander while her body performed the repetitive motions. The American women who worked alongside them were cautiously polite at first, maintaining distance, but curiosity eventually overcame reserve. What was it like? This question came in various forms from various women, usually whispered during breaks, laden with that peculiarly American combination of directness and uncertainty. What was it like living under Hitler? What was it like during the bombing? Did you know about the camps? Did you believe in it? Greta developed careful answers, not quite lies but not quite the full truth either. She'd been young, she explained. She'd worked in an office, typed requisition forms. She hadn't made decisions or carried a gun. She'd heard rumors, everyone had heard rumors, but the rumors seemed impossible, and anyway, what could one person do? It was the answer that let her questioners nod and return to work, satisfied that they'd encountered not a monster but an ordinary person caught in extraordinary circumstances. But alone at night, Greta examined these answers and found them wanting. She had heard rumors. She had seen things. That day in 1943 when they'd marched a line of ragged prisoners. She didn't know what kind of prisoners, political or military or something else. Past her office building, and she'd looked away, telling herself it wasn't her business, telling herself she had work to complete, telling herself that curiosity was dangerous. The sin of looking away, it turned out, weighed almost as much as the sin of looking directly at atrocity and participating. Ilsa struggled more visibly. She'd been assigned to a canning factory, and the work was harder, more physical. She came back to the barracks each evening with her hands stained and her shoulders aching, and slowly she began to crack around the edges. The nightmares started in their second week. Ilsa crying out in German about fire, about voices on the radio calling for help she couldn't send, about cities burning while she sat at her communication station helpless and complicit. "I relayed the orders," she told Greta one night, sitting on the edge of her bunk with her face in her hands. "When they sent the bombers to England, to London, to Coventry, I was just a girl at a radio station, following protocols, but I relayed the orders. I typed the coordinates. How many people died because my fingers pressed the right keys? You didn't make the decision to bomb anyone," Greta said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Neither did you, but we both carry it anyway, don't we?" Ilsa looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and fierce. "That's what I can't stand about this place. The kindness, the food, the Sunday trips to see how the other half lives. It makes it worse somehow because they should hate us. They should make us suffer. Instead they give us coffee and let us ride buses into Manhattan, and it makes me feel like I'm going insane because I can't figure out what I'm supposed to feel." Margaret dealt with it by becoming smaller. She spoke less each day, ate mechanically, worked her job at a commercial laundry in silence. She'd been assigned a bunk near Greta and Ilsa but might as well have been on another continent for all she engaged with the world around her. Greta recognized the signs. She'd seen them in soldiers at the supply depot near the war's end. Men whose minds had simply refused to process any more horror and had shut down everything but basic function. On their third Sunday in New York, only 97 women boarded the buses. The others had lost interest or lost nerve, content to spend their day off resting in the barracks, writing letters to families they hoped still existed, or simply staring at walls. Greta went because not going felt like surrender, and she'd surrendered enough already. Ilsa went because she was chasing something, punishment or understanding or perhaps just the next morning and the next, each day a small victory over the impulse to give up entirely. Margaret stayed behind. They'd planned to visit different parts of the city this time, to see beyond the tourist heart of Manhattan. Greta suggested Greenwich Village, remembering something she'd read years ago about artists and writers. Ilsa wanted to see the Brooklyn Bridge, for no reason she could articulate except that she'd seen it in a photograph once and it had seemed like something out of a dream. They took the subway, another marvel, this underground world of trains that ran on time, pulling into stations tiled in mosaics and color, carrying millions of people through the bedrock of Manhattan. Greta tried to imagine building such a thing, the vision and engineering and sheer hubris required to burrow beneath a city and create this separate circulatory system. Berlin had had subways too, of course, but they'd been repurposed as bomb shelters, packed with terrified civilians breathing stale air and praying the tunnels wouldn't collapse. Greenwich Village in autumn sunlight looked like someone had taken European charm and translated it into American dialect. Narrow streets that actually curved rather than conforming to the grid, brick townhouses with front stoops, small parks where old men played chess and young mothers pushed prams. Washington Square Park was alive with students from the university, their books and their arguments and their easy laughter speaking of a future they believed in. Greta and Ilsa sat on a bench and watched a group of young people rehearse a play, their voices carrying across the grass. One of the actors was explaining something about Chekhov, gesticulating wildly, and his companions laughed and argued back. They were maybe 22 years old, the same age as the boys who died in their millions across Europe and Russia and North Africa. But these American young people had been spared. They'd grown up in a country where the war was something happening elsewhere, something they read about in newspapers between classes, something their older brothers went off to fight while they stayed home and studied literature and prepared for peacetime lives. I can't decide if I hate them or envy them, Ilsa said quietly. Both, Greta replied. Both is probably fair. They walked east, past bookshops with volumes and windows that no one had burned, past cafes where people lingered over newspapers, past galleries showing art that hadn't been labeled degenerate and destroyed. On a side street, Greta noticed a small crowd gathered around a man speaking from a makeshift platform. Curious, they drifted closer. The speaker was older, maybe 50, with wild gray hair and a rumpled suit. He was talking about war and peace, about the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, about the moral calculus of ending one horror through the commission of another horror. His audience was mixed. Some nodding agreement, others shouting objections, everyone engaged in a fierce democracy of ideas. That's what they do here, said a voice beside Greta. She turned to find an elderly woman with kind eyes and an accent Greta couldn't place. They argue. It's their national sport. It's allowed, Greta asked carefully. The old woman laughed. Allowed? Dear, it's practically required. That's what this country was supposed to be about, at least in theory. You disagree with something, you stand on a box and say so. She studied Greta more closely. You're not from around here. Germany, Greta admitted. She waited for the reaction, but the old woman just nodded. I'm from Poland, Krakow originally. Got out in 37, thank God. Lost everyone else. She said it simply, as a fact, though the weight of it hung in the air between them. You know what I've learned, living here? Everyone's from somewhere else. Everyone's running from something or running toward something. That's what makes it work, maybe, or makes it tolerable anyway. A police officer walked by, twirling his nightstick, unconcerned with the speaker or the argument or the foreign women standing at the edge of the crowd. The casualness of it struck Greta profoundly. No secret police, no careful watch over who said what about whom. Just a cop on his beat, bored, thinking about lunch. They left the village and walked across the Brooklyn Bridge as the afternoon light turned golden. The bridge was its own kind of cathedral, its Gothic arches and web of cables creating a geometry that felt both ancient and modern. Below, the East River churned with boat traffic, tugboats and barges and ferries, the commerce of a living city. Halfway across, Ilsa stopped walking and gripped the railing. I need to tell you something, she said. Greta waited. "I'm not going back," Ilsa continued. Her voice was steady but her knuckles were white. "When they repatriate us. I'm not going back to Germany." "You might not have a choice," Greta said carefully. "There's always a choice. I'll run. I'll marry an American soldier. I'll figure out a way." Ilsa turned to face her. "What's waiting for me there? A country that doesn't exist anymore? A family I haven't heard from in a year and probably never will? I was part of a machine that destroyed everything, and now they want me to go back and help rebuild with people who'll remember what I was part of. I can't do it, Greta. I'd rather be illegal here than legal there." Greta understood. She'd had similar thoughts lying awake at night, though she'd lacked the courage to voice them. "And you think you could live here?" she asked. "Always looking over your shoulder. Always foreign. Always other? Better that than going back to the ashes," Ilsa said fiercely. "At least here there's something to look at besides ruins." They stood on the bridge as the sun descended toward New Jersey, turning the Manhattan skyline into a silhouette of ambition and survival. Greta thought about her compass, still wrapped in her handkerchief in her footlocker back at the barracks. The needle that pointed north regardless of where you wanted it to point. Maybe that was the problem. She'd been waiting for something external to show her the direction home, when home was a concept that needed redefining entirely. Back at camp that evening, they found Margaret sitting outside the barracks, smoking a cigarette someone had given her. She looked up as they approached, and her eyes were clearer than they'd been in days. "Did you have a good time?" she asked. "I think so," Greta said. "How was your day?" "I slept. Then I got up and helped Frau Bergman write a letter to her daughter. Then I realized something." Margaret took a drag and exhaled slowly. "This is the rest of our lives. However long they keep us here, however much longer the war hangs around like a ghost. This is it. We're not going to wake up and find out it was a bad dream. Germany isn't going to be what it was. Nothing's going to be what it was. So we can either figure out how to live with that or we can just not live. And I'm not ready to not live yet." It was the most Margaret had said in a week, and it carried the weight of decision. Greta sat down beside her, and Ilsa joined them, and they passed the cigarette between them in silence, watching the stars come out over New Jersey. The week that followed brought changes subtle and profound. Greta began staying after her shift at the textile mill to talk with a woman named Ruth, a second-generation Italian immigrant who worked the loom next to hers. Ruth was curious about Germany, not about the war specifically, but about the before times. What was Munich like? What did people eat? What kind of music did they listen to? The questions were innocent, almost naive, and Greta found herself answering them with increasing detail, remembering a version of herself and her country that had existed before everything went dark. "You know what's funny?" Ruth said one afternoon while they were cleaning their workstations. "My parents came here from Sicily because Italy was poor and hard and didn't offer them anything. They worked themselves to death so I could have better. And they did, I got better. But now Italy's free and they're talking about rebuilding. And my mother cries sometimes because she wonders if she made a mistake leaving." Ruth laughed without humor. "Grass is always greener, I guess. Or maybe just loss is loss, and it doesn't matter if you lost something good or something bad. It's still gone." Greta thought about that conversation for days. The idea that loss was universal, that the texture of grief wasn't really about what you'd lost but about the fact of losing itself. Her Germany, the one she'd known as a child, before Hitler, before the rallies and the uniforms and the descent into collective madness. That Germany was as dead as Ruth's mother's Sicily. They were both mourning places that existed only in memory, countries that had been transformed beyond recognition by history and time and human choice. The fourth Sunday, Greta went to New York alone. Ilsa was sick with a cold, and Margaret had been asked by Captain Morrison to help translate for a new group of arrivals from France. French women who'd been married to German soldiers and were now stateless, belonging nowhere, wanted by neither their birth country nor their husband's defeated nation. Greta rode the bus into Manhattan and wandered without plan or destination. She found herself in a church, St. Patrick's Cathedral, the guard had called it, drawn by some impulse she couldn't name. She wasn't particularly religious. Faith had been one more casualty of the war years, but the space itself called to her. The vaulted ceilings, the stained glass filtering sunlight into colors that seemed impossible, the quiet that was different from the quiet of fear or defeat. She sat in a pew and watched people come and go. An elderly man lighting candles. A young woman on her knees in prayer, her lips moving silently. A priest walking through with deliberate slowness, his face holding that peculiar expression of people who've devoted themselves to something larger than their own survival. Greta wondered what they were praying for. Probably not the same things she would pray for if she believed prayer could reach anyone. First visit. The question came from a woman sliding into the pew beside her. She was perhaps 40, dressed well but not ostentatiously, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples. Yes, Greta said. It's something, isn't it? I'm not even Catholic, but I come here sometimes when I need to think. The woman smiled slightly. I'm Jewish, actually. We lost family in the camps. Most of my father's side. But I figure God's got to be in here somewhere, and he's probably more forgiving than I am. Greta felt her stomach drop. This was it, then. The moment of revelation and consequence. She should say something, should explain herself, should. I know you're one of the German girls, the woman continued, her voice still gentle. I saw you come in with your group last week. Greta's throat closed. She wanted to run, wanted to disappear into the floor of this cathedral, wanted to be anywhere but sitting beside this woman whose family she, or people like her, people she'd worked alongside, had helped destroy. I'm sorry, Greta whispered. I'm so sorry. The woman was quiet for a long moment, staring at the altar. That's the thing nobody tells you about forgiveness, she finally said. It's not a decision you make once. It's a decision you make every single day, sometimes every single hour. And some hours I can manage it, and some hours I want to burn the whole world down. She turned to look at Greta directly. I don't know you. I don't know what you did or didn't do. But I know that sitting here hating every German person I meet doesn't bring my uncle back. Doesn't bring my cousins back. It just makes me into something smaller and meaner than I want to be. How can you even sit next to me? Greta asked. Because I'm tired, the woman said simply. I'm tired of carrying hate around like luggage. And because, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Because someone has to break the cycle. My rabbi, he said something last week. He said that in Hebrew, the word for peace, shalom, comes from the same root as shalom, which means whole or complete. Peace isn't just the absence of war. It's about becoming whole again. And we can't become whole if we're all walking around with pieces missing, refusing to even look at each other. She stood to leave, then hesitated. I'm not telling you it's okay. What happened? It's not okay. It will never be okay. But you're here and you're alive and you have a choice about what you do with that. Make it count for something. She walked away before Greta could respond, her footsteps echoing against stone. Greta sat in the cathedral until her legs cramped and the light through the stained glass had shifted its angle completely. The woman's words circled through her mind like birds looking for a place to land. Make it count for something. But what could possibly count enough? What could balance the scales against millions dead, against cities destroyed, against children who would never grow up and families who would never be reunited? There was no answer that satisfied. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the question itself was what mattered. Continuing to ask it, continuing to wrestle with it, refusing the easy comfort of either self-flagellation or self-forgiveness. When she emerged from the cathedral, the afternoon had turned cool. Greta walked south without thinking, her feet carrying her through the geometry of Manhattan's grid until she found herself at the edge of the Hudson River. The water was gray-brown and industrial, nothing like the clear alpine streams she remembered from childhood trips. But it was moving, flowing, going somewhere, and she stood watching it until the sun began its descent. A ferry horn sounded, deep and mournful. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the city noise. Across the river, New Jersey was a smudge of buildings and smokestacks, ordinary and unremarkable. Somewhere over there was the camp, the barracks, the narrow bed where she slept and dreamed and tried to imagine what came next. Greta pulled out her father's compass, holding it in her palm the way she had that first night in the barracks. The needle swung, settled, pointed north. But standing here at the river's edge, watching the water flow south toward the harbor and the ocean beyond, she realized that maybe the compass had been trying to teach her something all along. North was a direction, not a destination. It was a way of orienting yourself, of understanding where you stood in relation to the world, but it didn't tell you where you had to go. She could go north, back to Germany when they finally repatriated the prisoners. Back to the ruins and the recriminations and the impossible task of rebuilding a country from ash and shame. Or she could go in some other direction entirely, like Ilsa wanted to do. Or she could simply stand here at the river, paralyzed by choice, until choice was taken away from her again. The sun touched the horizon, painting the Hudson with streaks of orange and gold. Beautiful despite everything. The world kept being beautiful in moments, kept insisting on its own stubborn vitality even when humanity had done its best to destroy everything good. Greta closed her hand around the compass and made a decision. Not a big decision. She wasn't ready for those yet. Just a small one. She would go back to the barracks, and tomorrow she would wake up and she would go to work at the textile mill, and she would talk to Ruth about something other than loss. She would ask about Ruth's children, about her husband who worked at the docks, about the ordinary miraculous details of a life being lived forward instead of backward. And maybe that was enough to start with. Maybe wholeness began with the smallest possible actions, repeated until they became a life. The weeks accumulated into months. Winter came to New Jersey, bringing snow that transformed the camp into something cleaner and quieter. Greta learned to operate 3 different kinds of looms at the textile mill. She began taking English lessons offered twice weekly by a volunteer from a local church, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Patterson who was patient and demanding in equal measure. Greta's vocabulary expanded, and with it, her ability to navigate this strange American world. Ilsa's cold turned into pneumonia, and she spent 2 weeks in the camp infirmary. Greta visited daily, bringing contraband cookies from the cafeteria and news from the outside. When Ilsa recovered, she was thinner and quieter, and the wild talk of running away or staying in America had faded. She was making peace with something, though Greta couldn't tell if it was the past or the future or simply the present moment. Margaret found an unexpected talent. One of the women in the barracks had a harmonica, and Margaret began playing it in the evenings. Old German folk songs at first, then American songs she'd heard on the radio, then improvisations that belonged to no tradition but her own sadness and hope mingled together. People gathered to listen. Sometimes they sang along. Sometimes they just sat in silence, letting the music speak for all the things they couldn't say. On the last Sunday before Christmas, Greta made her 6th trip to New York. This time she went with a purpose. She'd saved her small wages and wanted to buy gifts for Ilsa and Margaret. The city was dressed for the holiday lights strung across streets, decorated windows in every shop, the enormous tree in Rockefeller Center that seemed to belong to a fairy tale rather than reality. She found a bookstore in Greenwich Village and bought Ilsa a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman, translated into German. For Margaret, she found sheet music for harmonica in a dusty music shop whose owner was so old, he might have been there when the city was founded. He wrapped the sheet music carefully and wished her a Merry Christmas, his eyes kind behind thick glasses. Walking back to the meeting point, Greta passed the same coffee shop where the waitress had given them free pie months ago. On impulse, she went inside. The place was busy with holiday shoppers, but Greta found a seat at the counter. The same waitress was there, older and more tired than Greta remembered, but still moving with that efficient New York energy. "What can I get you, honey?" the waitress asked, not recognizing her. "Coffee, please." And Greta hesitated. "And I wanted to thank you." The waitress looked at her more closely, and recognition dawned. "Oh, you're one of the German girls. From before." She poured the coffee, studying Greta's face. "You look different. Better, less like someone expecting the world to end." "I'm trying," Greta said. "It's hard to explain." "Don't have to explain," the waitress said. She leaned against the counter, a brief moment of rest in her long shift. "My son, the one who came back from France? He had that same look you girls had. Like he was seeing ghosts everywhere. Doctor called it shell shock or battle fatigue or some damn thing. But what it really was, I think, was just carrying too much. Too much death. Too much guilt. Too much of everything bad all at once. She refilled Greta's cup without asking. He's doing better now. Got a job, got engaged. Still has nightmares sometimes. But he's living. That's what matters. Living even when part of you thinks you don't deserve to. Greta felt tears prick her eyes. Did he ever talk about what he saw? What he did? Not much. But I told him the same thing I'll tell you. You can't change the past. You can only decide what you do with whatever time you got left. And spending it punishing yourself doesn't help anybody. Not the people who died, not the people still living. It just wastes the gift you got by surviving. Some gift, Greta said quietly. Yeah, well, take it up with God. I'm just slinging coffee and pie. But her smile was gentle, and when Greta tried to pay, the waitress waved her money away. Christmas present. Now get out of here before I start getting sentimental. On the bus back to camp, Greta sat with her packages and watched the city recede through the window. She thought about the waitress's words, about the woman in St. Patrick's Cathedral, about Ruth at the textile mill and Mrs. Patterson teaching English and Captain Morrison with her complicated compassion. All these Americans who had every reason to hate Germans and yet somehow found ways to extend small mercies, to see individuals rather than enemies, to believe in the possibility of something beyond vengeance. She thought, too, about her father and his compass, about how he'd meant it to help her find her way home, never imagining that home would cease to exist. But maybe home wasn't a place you returned to. Maybe home was something you carried with you, something you rebuilt wherever you found yourself standing. Maybe home was the choice to keep living, to keep trying, to keep believing that wholeness was possible even if you never quite achieved it. The repatriation order came in March of 1946, as winter was finally loosening its grip and the first hints of spring appeared in the camp's bare trees. They would be sent back to Germany in groups over the next 3 months. Greta's group was scheduled for May. The news settled over the barracks like ash. Some women were desperate to go home, to search for families, to try to piece together whatever remained of their former lives. Others, like Ilsa, were desperate to stay, though their options were limited. A few had married American soldiers and would remain legally. The rest would go back whether they wanted to or not. Greta spent her last weeks in America trying to memorize everything. The way coffee tasted when it was real. The sound of the city at night, that distant hum of traffic and life continuing. The feeling of walking down a street without fear, without constant vigilance. The small kindnesses and the large ones, the abundance and the waste, the innocence of a country that had never been bombed into submission. On her final Sunday in New York, she went alone to St. Patrick's Cathedral. She didn't expect to see the Jewish woman again. That encounter had been a gift, singular and unrepeatable. But she wanted to sit in that space one more time, to feel the weight of stone and silence, to try to carry some of that peace back with her across the Atlantic. She lit a candle, not sure who or what she was lighting it for. The dead, maybe. All the dead, regardless of which side they died on. Or the living, trying to figure out how to build something better from the wreckage. Or simply for the possibility of mourning, of waking up and choosing to keep going one more day. When she stood to leave, she found a small card tucked into the pew beside where she'd been sitting. On it, in careful handwriting, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, some are strong at the broken places." Hemingway. Greta didn't know if the card had been meant for her or left by accident. Didn't know who had placed it or when. It didn't matter. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket, next to the compass. The ship that carried them back across the Atlantic was crowded and cold. 347 women who had arrived as prisoners and were leaving as something more complicated. Survivors, witnesses, women who had seen the face of the enemy and found it disturbingly human. Greta stood at the railing as they approached the German coast, watching the land emerge from morning fog. It looked smaller than she remembered, and grayer. The port city was a skeleton of itself, more rubble than buildings, more absence than presence. This was home now. The ruins, the hunger, the massive undertaking of rebuilding not just cities but the entire idea of what their country could be. Ilsa stood beside her, silent. She tried and failed to find a way to stay in America. Now she was going back to a Bremen that probably didn't exist anymore, to search for family she would almost certainly never find. "I'm scared," Ilse said simply. "So am I," Greta admitted. "But we've been scared before. We know how to keep walking even when we're terrified." "Do you think it was worth it?" Ilse asked. "Those Sundays in New York. Seeing what we saw, learning what we learned about how life could be. Does it make going back harder or easier?" Greta considered. The honest answer was both: harder because now she knew what abundance looked like, what a society unbroken by war could achieve. Easier because she'd also learned that enemies could become complicated acquaintances, that forgiveness was possible even when it seemed impossible, that small acts of humanity could chip away at vast structures of hate. "I think," Greta said slowly, "it gave us something to build toward. We saw what a city looks like when it's not afraid, when it's whole. We can't make Germany into America, but maybe we can make it into something that remembers how to be whole." The ship docked. The women filed down the gangplank into a country that felt foreign despite being home. Greta carried two things in her pockets: her father's compass and the card from the cathedral. The compass to remind her where she'd come from. The card to remind her that being broken wasn't the end of the story. She had no idea what the next chapter would hold. No idea if she'd find her mother and sister, if she'd rebuild a life from the ashes, if she'd ever feel at home anywhere again. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would keep walking. One foot in front of the other, one day after the next, carrying her broken places like scars that proved she'd survived. Behind her, New York receded into memory and distance. Ahead, Germany waited, ruined, defeated, hungry, but still there, still possible. Greta took a breath of cold German air and stepped onto the dock. The war was over. The living remained. And somehow that would have to be enough to start with. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history. The moments that didn't make the textbooks but tell us something profound about who we are as human beings. Hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell, and leave a comment telling us what historical story you'd like to hear next.